You think you know what you would do. That's the comfortable lie we all tell ourselves at night, isn't it? When the wind is quiet and the doors are bolted and the worst thing in the world is a long way off, we are all so certain. We would do the right thing. We would be brave. We would open the door or close it exactly when we should. But the truth is, you don't know. None of us do. Not until the moment arrives wearing a face you didn't expect, bleeding into the dirt of your own yard, looking up at you with eyes that have already decided you will be the one to kill them. I was 31 years old when that moment came for me. I had buried a husband, lost 2 harvests, and learned to load a rifle faster than most men in that county. I thought I had already met the hardest version of myself. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you is not a story about heroes. There were no heroes on my land that summer. There were only frightened people, doing frightened things, and one decision that split my whole life into a before and an after. I have never told it all the way through. I'm an old woman now, and my hands shake when I write, and I have decided that some things should not die with the person who carried them. So pour something warm, settle in. This is the story of the morning a wounded man crawled into my barn, and the choice that nearly cost me everything I had left. The first thing I noticed was the blood, and the second thing I noticed was that the chickens had gone silent. I want to put that down plainly, because in all the years since, people have asked me what it felt like, and they expect me to say fear. But fear came later. In that first half second, standing in my own doorway with a tin cup of coffee going cold in my fist, what I felt was the simple animal wrongness of a quiet henhouse. My birds were never quiet. They fussed and gossiped from the moment the sky went gray. And here it was, full light, the sun already pushing heat into the dust, and not one of them had made a sound. I lived alone. I should say that now so you understand the shape of the thing. My husband Thomas had been 3 years dead by then, a horse, a bad fence, a wet morning, and the kind of luck that finds people who can least afford it. We'd had no children that lived. The 2 we made are buried under the cottonwood at the edge of the wash, with stones I cut myself because there was nobody else to do it. I ran the place alone. 40 acres of stubborn ground in the New Mexico territory, a barn that leaned a little more each winter, a milk cow named Patience who had outlived her name, and me. People in town thought I was a fool for staying. A woman alone on the edge of country where the army and the Apache were trading killings like coins. Sell up, they said. Come back east. Marry again. As if a second husband were a coat I could simply put on against the cold. I had spite enough in me to stay just to prove them wrong, and I'll not pretend otherwise. Stubbornness has kept more people alive on the frontier than courage ever did. Courage is a candle. Spite is a coal that won't go out. So the chickens were quiet, and I set my cup down on the step without quite knowing why, and I went back inside for the rifle. I keep things in order, always have. Thomas used to laugh at me for it, the way I numbered the fence posts so I'd know which needed mending, the way I kept a little ledger of everything that came and went, eggs and dollars and rainfall, all in my cramped little hand. You'd count the stars if you could reach a pencil to them, he said once. After he died, the counting got worse, not better. It was a way to make a world that had gone senseless behave for me, even just on paper. 6 eggs this morning. $2.40 in the coffee tin. 1 barrel of water going low. I had counted my whole grief into manageable little sums, and most mornings it almost worked. The rifle was loaded. It was always loaded. I crossed the yard slow, the way you'd approach a snake you couldn't see, and the henhouse stink of feathers and droppings came up warm in the heat, and the birds were huddled in the far corner of the run, every one of them pressed flat and watching the barn. The barn door stood open a hand's width. I had closed it the night before. I remembered closing it because I remembered the iron latch being stiff, the way it always was, and thinking I'd grease it. And there was the blood. A thin, broken trail of it, dark already, crossing the dust between the gate and the barn, the kind of trail a thing leaves when it is dragging itself and trying not to. I followed it with my eyes. It went under the door into the dark. I should have run. I have thought about this 10,000 times. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to back away, mount the mule, and ride the 4 hours to town and the soldiers, and let men with badges and bigger guns sort out whatever was bleeding in my barn. Any reasonable person would tell you so. But I had a cow in there, and a winter's worth of feed. And I will be honest, because I promised myself this account would be honest. I had a curiosity in me that had never once known when to lie down. So I put the rifle to my shoulder, and I toed the door wider with my boot, and I stepped into the dark of my own barn with my heart going like a trapped bird against my ribs. It took my eyes a moment. Stripes of light came through the wallboards, full of floating chaff, and patience shifted and lowed somewhere to my left, uneasy. And there, against the base of the grain bins, half curled in the straw like something that had washed up out of a flood, was a man. He was Apache. I knew it at once, though I'd seen few up close, by the cut of his hair, the band of cloth across his brow gone dark with sweat, the moccasins laced high. He was young, not a boy, but not far past it. And he was hurt in a way that I understood instantly and completely, because I had nursed a husband through a goring and had learned what bad bleeding looked like. His left side, from the ribs down, was soaked through and black, and the straw beneath him was matted with it, and his face had the gray, sunken look of a man whose body was running out of the thing that keeps it warm. His eyes were open. They found me. And what passed through them in that moment was not fear, though I expected fear. It was a kind of terrible, exhausted acceptance. He looked at the rifle, and then he looked at my face, and he made no move to defend himself because he hadn't the strength for it, and because I think he had already finished the conversation in his own head and decided how it would end. He thought I was going to shoot him. And here is the thing I have never been able to make people understand. The thing that haunts the edges of the whole story like a dog you can't chase off. For one long, cold, shameful breath, I considered it. Not because I wanted to. God, no. But because the world I lived in had a script for this moment, and the script was very clear. An Apache man wounded on a white woman's land in the summer of killings. The men in town would have called it self-defense before the smoke cleared. They would have called me brave. They might even have bought me a meal. I knew this the way you know which way water runs downhill. And in that breath, the script reached up out of the ground and put its hand over mine on the trigger. He saw it. I will never forget that he saw it. Something in his face, not a flinch, he hadn't the strength to flinch, but a kind of closing, a settling, the way a sky goes flat before rain. He turned his head a few degrees away from me toward the wall. He was giving me his neck. He was making it easier. That was what broke it. The way he turned away to make my killing of him more convenient. As though even at the bottom of his strength, the last courtesy he could offer the world was to make himself less trouble to murder. I lowered the rifle. My arms were shaking. I had not noticed until they had nothing to do. I stood there in the chaff light with the gun pointed at the floor and my heart slamming, and I heard myself say, in a voice that came out far steadier than I felt, "I'm not going to shoot you." He didn't understand the words, of course, but he understood the gun coming down. He turned his head back to look at me, and now there was something else in his eyes, confusion, I think, the kind a person feels when the floor they'd braced to fall through holds firm. He searched my face for the trick in it. There's always a trick. He'd lived long enough to know that. I crossed the barn and knelt down beside him, careful, the way you approach a hurt animal that might still have one bite left in it. Up close, he was worse than I'd thought. The wound in his side was a bullet's work. I could see where it had gone in, low on the ribs, and there was no exit that I could find. Which meant the thing was still in him, doing its quiet work. He had bound it with a strip of his own clothing, but that had given up hours ago. He smelled of sweat and blood, and the particular sharp green smell of the creosote brush he must have crawled through. There was a thorn still buried in the meat of his forearm, and dust caked into the lines of his face, and he was, I realized with a lurch, about the age my son would have been if my son had lived to be a man. I don't know why that thought came to me then. Grief is a strange mathematician. It is always doing sums in the dark that you didn't ask for. All right, I said mostly to myself, the way I talked to the cow and the chickens and the empty house. All right, let me think. Because now I had the real decision in front of me, and it was so much heavier than the one with the rifle. Killing him would have been a single moment, terrible and quick. Helping him was 1,000 moments, every one of them a fresh chance to be caught and ruined and worse. Let me lay it out the way I laid it out then, crouched in the straw with a dying man's blood soaking into the knee of my skirt, because I want you to understand that I was not some saint who acted without counting the cost. I counted it. I always count. If I helped him and he lived, he might cut my throat the moment he had the strength. I knew the stories. Everyone knew the stories, the cabins found burned, the families found in pieces. I did not entirely believe them even then, because I had learned that the stories people tell about the ones they're afraid of say more about the teller than the told. But I did not disbelieve them enough to be a fool. If I helped him and the army found out, I would be a traitor. There is no softer word for it, not in that place, not in that year. They were hanging men for less. A woman who sheltered an Apache warrior would lose her land at the kindest, and at the unkindest she would lose a great deal more, and no court in the territory would trouble itself over much about it. If I helped him and the Apache found out, for I knew they must be looking for him, kin or warband, somebody. They might come down on my place and not stop to ask whether I'd been a friend or a captor before they evened, whatever score had put a bullet in this boy. Every road from that barn led somewhere bad. I sat in the middle of all of it and I understood, with a clarity that almost made me laugh, that there was no safe choice left to me. The safe choice had ridden off the moment I lowered the gun. Now there was only the choice I could live with, and the choice I couldn't, and I had about a minute to tell them apart. He was watching me think. That's the part I keep coming back to. He lay there with his life leaking out of him, and instead of begging or threatening or going slack, he watched me with those dark, steady eyes, like a man trying to read weather. And I understood that he was doing exactly what I was doing. He was counting the cost too. He was trying to work out whether the woman in front of him was a mercy or a slower kind of death. We were two people, each terrified of the other, each holding the other's whole life in our shaking hands. "Damn it," I said. And I got up, and I went to fetch the water and the rags and the sewing kit, because somewhere in the counting, without quite deciding it, I had already decided. I want to tell you it was simple after that, but nothing about it was simple. He could not stand. I could not lift him. He was a grown man gone to dead weight, and I was strong from the work of the place, but I was not that strong, and the first thing I had to do was get him out of the open part of the barn where anyone wandering in would see him at once. There's a hollow behind the grain bins, a low space where I stored the old harness Thomas never could bring himself to throw out, and I cleared it with my arms full of leather and dust, and got down beside him, and tried to make him understand with my hands what I needed him to do. He understood faster than I deserved. He was clever, even half dead. When I braced under his good arm, he used what he had left, pushing with his heels, biting down on a sound that wanted to be a scream and came out instead as a long, low hiss through his teeth. And between the two of us we moved him, a foot at a time, into the dark behind the bins. By the end of it, he was the color of ash, and I was crying without having noticed I'd started. And we lay there side by side in the straw, both of us breathing like we'd run a mile. Two strangers who could not speak a word to one another, and had just done the most intimate, desperate work two people can do. Then I cleaned the wound. I will spare you the worst of it. I had done such work before, but never with a bullet I couldn't reach, and the truth is I could not get it out. It was in too deep, near something I was afraid to touch, and I knew that if I went digging blind I would likely kill him faster than the lead would. So I did what little I could. I cleaned it. I packed it. I stitched the torn lips of it closed over the trouble inside, the way you'd close a wall over a leak and pray the water found its own way out. My stitches were a milkmaid's stitches, ugly and sure, the same hand that mended grain sacks. He watched me do it. He did not make a sound the whole time, though I felt him shaking, and once when the needle went deep, his hand came up off the straw and gripped my wrist. Not to stop me, but only to hold on to something, the way a person grips the edge of a table in a fall. Then he let go and put his hand back down and looked at me as if to apologize for the weakness of it. When I was done, I sat back on my heels and looked at what I'd made, this rough mended thing that might still die in my barn before nightfall, and I had the strangest thought. I thought, I have not touched another living person in 3 years. Not a hand, not a shoulder, not a thing. The whole country could have forgotten I had a body at all. And here I was, my hands slick with the blood of a man whose name I didn't know, and it was the most company I had felt since I lowered Thomas into the ground. I am ashamed of how much that meant to me. I'll set it down anyway. I gave him water slow, a little at a time, the way you do, my hand behind his head and his throat working and his eyes on me the whole while. I had nothing for the pain. I gave him a strip of dried beef to bite on instead, and he took it, and I think the ordinary animal fact of being given food did something for him that the doctoring couldn't. People forget that. When you are at the very bottom, it is not the grand gestures that pull you back. It is being handed a thing to chew. It is somebody deciding you are worth the trouble of keeping fed. I named him in my head because I needed something to call him in the ledger of my own mind, and my mind cannot abide a blank. I did not know his true name and would not learn it for some time. So I called him privately, foolishly, after the only Apache word I knew, which a freighter had taught me years before and sworn meant friend, though for all I know it meant something filthy, and the freighter had been laughing at me ever since. I will not write the word here, in case it was the filthy one. But I held it in my mouth like a small stone, and it made him a person instead of a problem, and that was what I needed. That first day I did almost no work on the place. I let the weeds grow and the water barrel sit. I sat in the barn with my rifle across my knees, between the wounded man and the door, and I watched the light move across the floor in its stripes, and I listened. Every sound from the road was the army coming. Every cry of a far-off bird was a war party. My nerves wore down to wire. Twice I heard riders in the distance, and twice I got up with my heart in my throat, and twice they passed on by. And twice I sat back down shaking, and the man watched me do all of it. And I think he came to understand in those long hours exactly what I was risking by letting him stay. Because here is what I had not expected in all my grim counting of costs. I had expected gratitude or treachery or fear. I had not expected to be understood. But somewhere in that endless first afternoon, as we sat in the dark not speaking, each of us learning the other the way you learn a horse, by watching what it does when it thinks it isn't seen, somewhere in there, a thing passed between us that did not need words. He saw me jump at the riders. He saw me put my body between him and the door. He saw that I was as frightened as he was, and that I was doing it anyway. And once, late in that first day, when the light had gone gold and long, and the henhouse had finally started up its evening fuss as though the world were ordinary, he reached out slowly. So I would not startle, and he touched the back of my hand where it rested on the rifle, just for a moment. A rough, dry, fever-hot touch. And he said something low in his own tongue, 3 or 4 soft words I could not understand. I have spent the rest of my life wondering what they were. I like to think it was thank you, but I have lived long enough to know that the things we say at the bottom of our lives are rarely so simple as thank you. Sometimes they are warnings. Sometimes they are the truth we've been too proud to say in any language but the one nobody around us speaks. I closed my hand over his, just for that moment, before either of us could think better of it. Then I heard the dog. Not my dog, I had no dog. The dog was a long way off down the road, and it was barking the particular furious bark dogs make at men on horseback. And under the barking, faint and getting less faint, was the sound I had been dreading and pretending I wasn't, since the moment I saw the blood in the dust that morning. The sound of soldiers coming up my road. There were 3 of them, and I counted them before I could stop myself. 3 riders, 3 rifles, 3 sets of eyes, because counting is what my hands do when my heart wants to climb out through my mouth. I had perhaps a minute, maybe less. I shut the barn door the rest of the way, dropped the iron latch I'd never gotten around to greasing, and the stiffness of it nearly undid me. I had to throw my whole weight against the wood and lever the latch down with both hands, and it gave with a screech that sounded, in that moment, loud enough to carry to the territorial capital. Then I turned and pressed my back against the door, and looked at the man in the straw behind the grain bins, and I said the only thing I had time to say. Quiet, whatever happens, quiet. He could not understand my words, but he understood the look on my face, and he understood the sound of horses, and he did a thing I have never forgotten. He took the strip of dried beef I'd given him earlier, the one he'd been working between his teeth, and he pushed it into his own mouth and bit down on it, not to eat, but to have something to bite when the pain came, so that he would not cry out. He had figured out in that half-second exactly what I needed from him and exactly how to give it. Then he closed his eyes and went so still he might have been one more shadow among the harness and the dust. I have known men my whole life who could not manage that much self-command with a full belly and a roof over their heads. He did it bleeding, fevered, and unable to flee. I think of that whenever someone tells me what those people were, as though they knew. They did not know. I barely knew, and he was lying in my barn. I smoothed my skirt. There was blood on the knee of it, dark and dry, and I turned the fold of the fabric to hide it as best I could, and I pasted onto my face the particular expression I had worn at Thomas's funeral, the one that gives away nothing because it has already given away everything. And I went out to meet the soldiers. They had stopped in the yard, the 3 of them, and the lead man had already dismounted. He was an officer, or near enough, a lieutenant, I learned later, named Cawley, with a sunburned neck and a mustache he was too young to fill out, and the kind of careful politeness that frightens me far more than rudeness ever has. Rude men show you their edges. Polite men keep theirs hidden until they need them. "Ma'am," he said and touched his hat, "sorry to trouble you, you're alone out here." "I am," I said. There was no use lying about it, the whole county knew. 3 years now. "That's hard," he said, and I believe he even meant it. He looked around the yard, the lean of the barn, the low water barrel, the chickens settling, and I watched him take the measure of the place and decide it was poor and harmless and run by a widow with more grit than sense. I let him think it. I have spent my life being underestimated, and I have learned that it is, more often than people credit, a kind of armor. "We're tracking a man," he said. "Apache, hostile. There was an engagement 2 days east of here by the river. He took a wound and ran, and we lost him in the brush, but we've cut his sign twice since, and it's pointing this direction." He paused, and his eyes came back to my face, and there was the edge, just for a second, sliding out from behind the politeness. "You see anything, anyone, tracks, smoke, your animals acting strange?" My chickens, I thought. My silent chickens that morning. Had he seen anything in the dust by the gate? I had not cleaned it, there had been no time, that thin, broken trail of blood crossing the yard. I did not dare look toward it. I kept my eyes on his. "My cow's been restless," I said, which was true, and which was the kind of small true thing that makes a lie sit easier. "Coyotes, I expect. They've been bold this summer. Came right up to the hen house 2 nights back." Also true. I have found that the strongest lies are built almost entirely out of true things, with only the one load-bearing falsehood hidden in the middle of them where nobody thinks to look. He nodded slowly. "Nothing else, no strangers." "Lieutenant," I said, and I let a little of my real weariness into it, because I had a great deal of real weariness, and it cost me nothing to spend some. "I haven't seen a stranger out here in 2 months. And the last one tried to sell me a Bible I couldn't read and a horse that was lame in 3 legs. If an Apache warrior is wandering my land, he's keeping better company than I do." One of the men behind him laughed short, surprised. Even Cawley's mouth twitched under the thin mustache. And I felt the thing turn, the way you feel a heavy door begin to swing once you've got it moving. They had decided I was a tired, lonely, slightly sharp-tongued widow, and tired, lonely widows do not hide enemy warriors in their barns. The story they carried about who I was had become my shield. It is a strange and bitter thing to be saved by the smallness of what people believe you are. But Cawley was not quite finished, and this is the part where my heart nearly stopped in my chest. "Mind if we water the horses," he said, "and have a look in your barn. He's hit hard if he found a place to hole up. A barn's just the kind of thing he'd crawl into. We'll be quick. It's for your own safety, ma'am, as much as anything." For your own safety. The phrase has never sounded the same to me since. There is a whole world contained in the way men use it. I want to tell you I had a clever answer ready. I didn't. My mind went white and flat as a salt pan. Every sum I'd been running fell straight out of my head, and I stood there in my own yard with a hole opening up under me, and the only thing I had was the truth that I could not let them in that barn, and the certainty that refusing would damn me as surely as agreeing. So I did the only thing left. I made it about the cow. "You can water the horses at the trough by the gate," I said, "but I'd ask you to keep clear of the barn, and I'll tell you why. My cow's near to calving, and she's gone mean with it, kicked the rail clean off her stall yesterday and like to broke my arm. You go banging around in there with 3 horses and your rifles, and she'll do herself a hurt I can't afford. And I'll be honest with you, Lieutenant, that cow is the difference between me eating this winter and me not. If your man's in my barn, he's welcome to whatever a mean cow leaves of him. But I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me bring her out calm myself before you go turning the place over." It was a wild lie. Patience had never been mean a day in her gentle life and was not within months of calving. But it was a lie shaped exactly like the truth a man like Cawley already believed, that I was poor, that the cow was everything, that a widow's whole economy could turn on the temper of one animal. He believed it because it fit. We do not believe what is true, we believe what fits. And it gave me a way to open the barn myself, on my own terms. He hesitated. I could see him weighing it, the chance of the man being in there against the trouble of a kicked-up cow and a widow's complaint that might find its way to his commanding officer. Then he nodded. "Bring her out, then. We'll wait, but I do want to look once she's clear." My legs nearly went out from under me with the reprieve and the dread of it both. I went to the barn. I lifted the screeching latch with hands I willed not to shake, and I slipped inside into the stripe-lit dark, and I went straight to Patience's stall, and I put my face against her warm flank for 1 second, 1 breath, the way I used to put my face against Thomas, and I whispered, "Help me, old girl, help me lie." I did not look toward the grain bins. I did not dare. But as I unlooped Patience's tether and turned her toward the door, I let my eyes pass once fast, over the dark hollow where the man lay, and I saw the faint wet gleam of his open eyes watching me, and I saw, in the set of him, that he had heard the soldiers' voices through the wall and understood every danger that I understood, and I saw that he had pressed himself flat into the shadow and laid the old harness leather over his own legs to break up the shape of him, so that even if a man glanced into that hollow, he'd see only tack and shadow, and not the long line of a hidden body. He was helping me hide him. From inside the trap, with his own death walking around the yard, he was thinking of how to keep me safe. I led the cow out into the light. I made a show of her, God forgive me. I let her balk and sidestep. She was confused by the strange horses, which helped, and I clucked and fussed and warned the soldiers back, and I led her to the far side of the yard and made a great business of calming her. And while their eyes were on the cow, on the poor harmless drama of a widow and her beast, the lieutenant went into the barn with one of his men, and I stood in the sun with my hand on Patience's neck and her great slow heart beating under my palm, and I waited to lose everything. I could hear them in there, boots on the boards, the creak of the loft ladder taking a man's weight, the dry rustle as somebody pushed at the hay. I counted his footsteps. I could not help it. 11 steps in. A pause. 4 steps to the left, toward the bins, toward the hollow, toward the man lying under the harness with beef between his teeth and his open eyes fixed on the dark. My whole life balanced on those 4 steps. I have never in all my years been so completely held in another person's hand, as I was in the hand of that lieutenant in those few seconds, and he did not even know he was holding me. Then I heard him say, muffled, nothing, just tack and a lot of dust, and the footsteps came back toward the light. I do not remember breathing again. I only remember that the world, which had gone very far away, came rushing back all at once. The heat, the chicken smell, the weight of the cow leaning into my hand, and that I had to lock my knees to keep standing. Collie came out blinking into the sun. "All right, ma'am. Sorry to trouble you." He swung up onto his horse, and the 3 of them watered at my trough, and the whole time my heart was beating go, go, go so loud I was sure they could hear it. And just before they turned to ride out, the lieutenant looked back at me, and there was a softness in his young, sunburned face that I have never been able to forgive him for, because it would have been so much easier to hate him if he had been cruel. "You ought not be out here alone," he said. "It isn't safe. If you saw this man, if he ever turns up, you fire 3 shots fast and will come, day or night. You hear?" He meant it kindly. He was offering me protection. He was, in his way, a decent young man doing a job that the times had handed him, and he had no idea that the very mercy he was offering would have cost a life I had decided to keep. "I hear you, Lieutenant," I said. 3 shots. I never fired them. They rode out the way they'd come, the dust closing up the road behind them, and I stood in my yard holding my cow until the sound of them was gone. And then for a while after that, because I no longer trusted my legs. And then I led Patience back to her stall, and I shut the barn door, and I went and knelt down by the hollow behind the grain bins, and I lifted the old harness off the man's legs. He had bitten clean through the strip of beef. There was blood on his lip where he'd bitten that too, and his eyes, when they found my face, were full of a question I could read across every barrier of language and blood and history between us. "Why," the eyes said, "why did you do that?" I had no answer for him. I'm not sure I have one now. I only know that I had stood in the sun and lied to armed men of my own people to keep a stranger of theirs alive, and that I would do it again, and that I could not have told you in plain words what made me, except that he had turned his head to make his own killing easier. And something in me had decided that a world where men do that is a world that has gone too far, and that I would not add my own small weight to it. I gave him fresh water. My hands shook so badly I spilled half of it. He drank what I managed, and then, and this is the thing that broke me, after all the lying and the fear had held me together, he lifted his hand and steadied the cup against my shaking with 2 of his fingers, holding it for me. After everything I had just done for him, his first thought was for the trembling of my hands. I sat down hard in the straw, and I put my face in my arms, and I wept the way I had not wept since I buried my children, great ugly tearing sobs that I could not have stopped if the whole army had come back to watch. 3 years of being strong, of being stubborn, of counting my grief into little columns so it could not get loose, and it all came up at once, there in the dark, because a half-dead enemy had steadied my hands around a cup of water. He did not touch me. He had the grace not to. He only waited, the way I had waited for him in the long afternoon, and let me have it, and when it was over and I lifted my swollen face, he was looking at me with an expression I had no name for. Not pity, not gratitude, something older and quieter than either. The look of one person who has seen the bottom of things recognizing another who has been there too. He lived through the night. I had not been sure he would. I made up my mind to sleep in the barn. I could not stomach the thought of him alone in the dark, fevered, with the wound doing its hidden work. And so I dragged in the straw tick from my own bed and laid it down a little distance from him, with the rifle between us, out of an old habit I no longer entirely believed in. I slept in snatches. Every time I woke I listened for his breathing, the way I used to listen for my Bobby's, and every time it was there, ragged and shallow, but there, I let myself fall back down into the dark. Near dawn the fever broke. I knew because he started shivering, that hard, teeth-rattling shake that comes when the body finally turns the corner, and I had no proper blankets to spare, so I did the only thing there was to do. I lay down against his good side, the way you'd warm a chilled lamb, and I put my arm across him to share what heat I had, and I felt him go rigid with surprise and then, slowly, let himself lean into it. Two strangers in the straw, sharing warmth like animals, because that is what we are under everything, when the fever comes and the night is cold, and there is no one else. I am old now, and I have outlived every soul who might be scandalized by it, so I will say it plainly. It was not shameful, and it was not what a coarse mind might make of it. It was the purest thing I have ever done. It was two frightened animals keeping each other alive. There is more holiness in that than in most of what passes for it. In the gray of the morning, with the chickens starting up and the light coming back into the world, he spoke to me again. Low, careful, the same soft words as before, and then, slowly, watching to see if I understood, he touched his own chest and said a word. A name. His name. He said it twice, so I would have it. I will not write it here. It was given to me as a gift, and I have kept it as one, and some gifts are spoiled by being passed around. But I said it back to him badly, my white mouth mangling the shape of it, and he almost smiled, the first thing near a smile I had seen on him, and he shook his head and said it again, patient, until I came near enough. And then he touched my chest, the way I'd touched his, asking. I told him my name. And in that little exchange, two people in a leaning barn at dawn, trading the only thing we truly own, which is what we are called, something settled between us that all the lying to soldiers and stitching of wounds had not quite settled. We were no longer the white woman and the Apache. We were no longer the rancher and the warrior, the captor and the captive, the danger and the danger. We were two named people, and a named person is so much harder to give up than a stranger. Which was the whole trouble, because somewhere out east, by the river where the engagement had been, there were people who had given him a name long before I learned it. A mother, perhaps, brothers, a band that had lost him in the brush and was even now cutting his sign the way the soldiers had cut his sign, working back toward wherever the trail had led, toward my 40 stubborn acres, toward my leaning barn, toward me. I had been so afraid of the army that I had nearly forgotten the other danger entirely. But that morning, as I was carrying out the slop bucket, I saw it. Far off, on the rise to the east where the brush gave way to open ground, two riders sitting still, watching. They did not come closer. They did not need to. They sat their horses with the unhurried patience of people who know the thing they are looking for is near and is not going anywhere. And after a while, they turned and were gone back into the brush. And I stood in my yard with the slop bucket dripping and understood that the choice I had made was not finished with me yet. I had saved him from the soldiers. Now I would have to decide what to do about his own people coming for him, and whether saving his life had only meant keeping him alive long enough to lose him, one way or another, to the country that had made us both. For 6 days I lived between two kinds of watching, and I will tell you that it is a particular cruelty to be hunted from two directions at once by people who would both call themselves the righteous ones. The riders came back to the eastern rise on the 2nd day, and the 3rd and the 5th, never closer, never gone for long. I took to keeping a tally of them on the inside of the barn wall, scratched into the wood with a nail, not because the number mattered, but because my hands needed the work, and because a thing you have counted feels, however falsely, like a thing you have some hold over. 2 riders on the 2nd day, 3 on the 3rd. 2 again on the 5th, but they sat longer, and one of them rode a paint horse I came to know the way you know a face. They were not soldiers. They sat their animals too easy for soldiers, and they came and went like weather, and I understood without being told that they were his. Kin or warband or both. They knew he was near. They were waiting for something, for him to mend enough to signal them perhaps, or for me to make a mistake, or simply for the right dark. And the soldiers did not forget me either. Twice that week I saw dust on the southern road and made myself ready to lie again. And once a different patrol stopped to water and to ask the same tired questions. And I gave the same tired answers and they rode on. And I aged a year each time. So I lived in the narrow space between them. And in that narrow space, the man I had named in my head and then learned the true name of the man I will go on calling, for your sake, simply him, got slowly, stubbornly better. It was not a smooth thing. On the third night he worsened again, the wound going hot and angry around my milkmaid stitches, and I lay awake certain I would lose him after all and half mad with the helplessness of it. I did the only doctoring I knew. I drew off the foulness as best I could. I bathed it. I made a poultice of the things my grandmother had sworn by, bread, and what herbs I had. And I sat up the whole night with my hand on his chest, counting his breaths the way I'd counted everything else in my life that I was afraid to lose. By morning the heat had gone down. The bullet, I think, had finally worked itself toward the surface, the way a splinter does, and on the fourth day I could feel the hard wrongness of it just under the skin of his back, and I knew that this time I could reach it. I will not pretend I was steady. I heated my knife in the lamp until the blade went black, and I gave him the harness leather to bite, and I told him with my eyes what I meant to do, and he understood and nodded and turned onto his side and gripped the bin with his good hand, and I cut. He made a sound. He could not help it. A single deep grunt swallowed back almost as soon as it escaped, and then he held so still I could feel the discipline of it shaking through his whole body. And the lead came out into my palm, small and dull and ugly, a misshapen little nothing that had nearly killed a man, and I held it up so he could see it, and he looked at it for a long moment and then he laughed. It was the first time I heard him laugh. It was a cracked, weak, astonished sound, the laugh of a man looking at the small, stupid object that had so nearly ended him, and I started laughing too, the two of us in the bloody straw laughing like fools at a piece of lead, and Patience lowed at us in complaint, and the chickens fussed, and for one moment the whole world was just a barn full of relief. After that he healed in earnest, and as he healed, the thing I had been refusing to look at came up out of the ground and stood in front of me where I could no longer pretend not to see it. He would leave. Of course he would leave. That had always been the only ending that made any sense. He was not mine to keep. He had a people and a name and a life that had nothing to do with me, and the riders on the eastern rise were that life, waiting. I had known it from the start, the way you know that a guest will go home, that a season will turn, that everything you let yourself love is on loan. But knowing a thing and feeling it arrive are different animals, and the feeling of it arrived for me on the 6th day, when he stood up. He had been getting stronger by degrees, sitting up, then standing with his hand on the bin, then taking small careful steps along the wall while I hovered like a fool. But on the 6th day he stood up in the middle of the barn, unsupported, and he stayed standing, and he looked down at himself, at his own legs holding him, at the mended wound, at the body I had hauled and stitched and warmed back into working, and then he looked at me, and we both understood at the same moment what it meant. He was a man again, not a patient, not a thing in my keeping, a man who could walk out of my barn and back into his own world. And I felt my heart break a little, and I was ashamed of it because what right did I have? I had saved his life. The whole point of saving a life is that the life goes on past you. To want to keep him would be to want him still wounded, still helpless, still mine, and I would sooner have died than wish that on him. But the heart does not consult the conscience before it breaks. It just breaks and leaves you to sort out afterward what it meant. That was the night I made the decision the whole story had been building toward, the life-changing one. And I want to be careful in how I tell it, because people hear decision and they expect a grand thing, a fork in a road, a moment of trumpets. It was not like that. It was small and quiet and made in the dark, and it changed everything, and most of the decisions that change everything are exactly that small. Here was the shape of it. He could not simply walk out and across the open ground to the eastern rise. The soldiers were patrolling that country hard. A lone Apache man on foot, still weak, would be ridden down and shot inside an hour, and all my saving of him would have bought him nothing but a longer way to the same grave. His own people could not come fetch him without crossing the same open ground in daylight or risking my place in the dark, and bringing the whole weight of the army down on all of us. He was healed enough to live and not healed enough to run. He was, in a word, trapped, and the only thing in that whole country that could move freely between the two dangers, that could cross the open ground without being shot or questioned, that the soldiers had already searched and dismissed, and the warband had already watched and understood, was a tired widow with a cow and a wagon. Me, I was the only safe passage left in the world, and I knew, lying there in the dark listening to him breathe, that if I wanted him to live truly live, not just survive my barn, I was going to have to be the one to carry him out, across the open ground, to his people. In my own wagon, in plain sight, with my own hands on the reins, gambling my land and my freedom, and quite possibly my neck on the chance that I could lie my way through one more patrol, with a wounded enemy hidden in the bed of my wagon under the feed sacks. There was a safer choice, of course. There is always a safer choice, and it is always the one that costs someone else everything. I could have kept him until he was strong enough to slip out alone and washed my hands of what happened to him after and called myself blameless. I could have, in plain truth, simply put him out, told him with my hands that he was healed, that the danger to me was too great, that he must take his chances. No one would have faulted me. I had already done more than any sane person in that country would have done. The ledger of my obligation was more than balanced. I owed him nothing. But I have never, in my whole stubborn life, been able to do the thing that lets someone else pay my bill, and I had carried him this far. And a thing you have carried that far, you do not set down a step short of where it needs to go. Just because the last step is the steepest. I had learned that lesson in a graveyard under a cottonwood tree, burying things I had not been able to carry far enough, and I was not going to learn it again. So I decided I would take him to his people myself. I told him in the morning as best I could without words. I pointed to the wagon, to the eastern rise, to him, to me. He understood far too fast, and he refused. That surprised me. He shook his head hard and pointed at the road where the soldiers came, and pointed at me, and drew his hand across his own throat. They will kill you, and pointed again at himself and at the open ground, as though to say he would take his own chances and not spend my life to save his. We stood there in the barn arguing in pantomime, two people with no language between us fighting over which of us was allowed to risk more for the other, and it would have been comical if it had not been the most serious argument of my life. I won it the way I have won most things, by being more stubborn. I picked up the reins and I started hitching the wagon, and I would not look at him, and after a while he stopped arguing and came and helped me, slow and careful with his healing side, and I knew I had won, and I took no joy in it, because winning meant losing him a few hours sooner. We waited for the dark of the moon. I packed him into the wagon bed and laid the feed sacks over him the way he himself had taught me to break up a shape, and I put my grandmother's quilt under him because the boards were hard, and because I wanted him to have it, and I climbed up onto the seat and clucked to the mule and Patience both. I brought the cow, tied behind, because a widow moving her stock looks like a widow moving her stock, and not like a smuggler carrying a man to the enemy. And I drove out across the open ground in the dark, with my heart in my throat for the last time. I will not stretch out the crossing. We were stopped once. A picket, two soldiers I did not know, who held a lantern up to my face and asked where a woman thought she was going at such an hour, and I told them my cow was sick, and there was a man to the east who could doctor stock and would not come to me, so I was taking her to him, and it was a poor lie and a tired one, and I was too frightened to make it good. But they were young and bored and cold, and a sick cow is the most boring thing in the world, and they waved me on the way you wave on a thing too dull to bother with. I do not know to this day whether they simply believed me, or whether one of them looked at my face and saw a widow at the end of her rope and decided, out of some mercy he'd have denied having, to let her pass. I have chosen to believe the second thing. It costs me nothing now, and the world is easier to bear if you let yourself believe that mercy happens more often than it gets credit for. We reached the broken ground at the foot of the eastern rise an hour before dawn, and they were there. They had been there, I think, the whole way, shadows packing us out in the dark, the soft sound of unshod hooves on stone that I felt more than heard. When I stopped the wagon, 3 of them came out of the dark on foot, and one of them rode the paint horse I had learned, and they were armed. And for one cold moment I sat on that wagon seat absolutely certain that I had driven myself to my own death, that they would take him and kill me for having had him, and that my last clever lie had been to the soldiers and not to myself. Then he sat up in the wagon bed, pushing the feed sacks away, and he said something, his name, I think, and then other words, fast and urgent, and everything changed. There was a sound from the men, low, a sound I had no word for, the sound people make when something they had given up for dead comes back. The one on the paint horse was off it before I saw him move. They crowded to the wagon, and the man I had carried so far reached down and gripped a forearm, and another, and there was a moment of pure animal reunion that I had no part in and no right to and could not look away from, the joy of people who had lost one of their own and were getting him back. And I sat on the wagon seat with the reins slack in my hands and wept for the second time in that whole long week, quietly this time. Because some part of me was glad past all bearing, and some part of me was breaking, and there was no contradiction in it at all. He turned back to me. They were all looking at me now, these armed strangers, and there was wariness in it still. I was what I was, and they were what they were, and one wagon ride does not unmake a war. But there was something else, too. He spoke to them, gesturing at his own heeled side at the wagon at me, and I watched the wariness in their faces shift, slowly, into something I can only call astonishment. He was telling them. The lying to the soldiers, the stitching, the night the fever broke. He was telling them what I had done, and I watched grown warriors look at a tired white widow on a feed wagon and not quite know what to do with the size of it. The man on the paint horse, older, gray coming into his hair, and something in the set of him that made me think father, though I will never know, got down and came to the wagon and looked up at me for a long moment. Then he took something from around his own neck, a small thing on a cord, and he held it up to me. A gift. I have it still. I will not describe it because it was given in a moment too private to lay out for strangers, and because some things lose their whole meaning the instant you try to make others see them. I took it. I bowed my head. There were no words we shared, but there did not need to be. We both knew what had passed. And then it was time, and there was no way to make it not be time. He climbed down out of my wagon, slow, careful, his hand at his side. He stood in the broken ground in the gray before dawn, on his own legs, among his own people, a free man, alive. And I understood that this was the thing I had been working toward the whole time, the whole point of every lie and stitch and sleepless night, and that getting it meant losing him, and that I would not have traded it for anything, and that it was going to hurt for the rest of my life. He came back to the wagon one last time. He put his hand on my hand where it held the reins, the same dry, sure grip, no longer fever-hot, just warm now, just a living man's hand, and he said the soft words he had said that first afternoon in the barn, the 3 or 4 I had never understood, the ones I have spent my whole life turning over. And this time he said them looking straight into my face, slow, as though he knew I could not understand them and was saying them anyway, because some things have to be said in the only tongue you have, to be heard by someone who cannot translate them, just so that they have been said at all. I have asked over the years. I learned a little of the language later in the way you do when a thing matters to you. I have asked people what those words might have been. I have gotten different answers, and I have never been sure of any of them, and I have come to think that not knowing is its own kind of keeping. If I knew, the words would be finished. As it is, they go on. They are still being said. He let go of my hand. He stepped back. The light was coming up gray and then gold over the rise, and the chickens, miles off at my own place, would be starting their morning fuss to an empty yard, and the soldiers would be stirring in their camps, and the whole ordinary terrible world was cranking itself back into motion. And he turned and walked into it, his people closing around him, up the rise and into the brush, and not once. I held my breath for it. God help me. I wanted it so badly and was so ashamed of wanting it. Not once did he look back. I have decided that this was a kindness too. That he knew, the way he had known everything, that a man who looks back makes the leaving harder, and that the last gift he had to give me was to walk away clean, so that I would not have to watch him grow small. He had turned his head away once before to make a hard thing easier for me. I think he did the same again. I turned the wagon around. I drove home in the full light of morning, a tired widow and a mule and a perfectly healthy cow, and no soldier so much as glanced at me, because there was nothing to see. There was only a woman who had done a thing the whole world would have told her not to do, and would now never tell anyone, driving home across the open ground with the sun on her face. I never saw him again. I want to give you more than that because I know it is what you came for, the reunion years later, the proof that it all meant something, the neat knot tied at the end. I cannot. I do not have it. The frontier swallowed people, white and red alike. And the years that followed were hard years for his people, harder than I can set down here without my hand failing me. I heard things, later, second-hand, that I have chosen not to confirm, because as long as I do not confirm them, all the endings are still possible, and I would rather hold all of them open than close them down to the one that history would likely insist on. So I will tell you what I do have. I have a small thing on a cord that I keep in a box with my husband's wedding ring and a lock of 2 children's hair, which is to say in the box where I keep the people I have loved and lost. I have 3 or 4 soft words in a language I never fully learned, that are still, as I told you, being said. I have a scar on the inside of my barn wall where I scratched my tally of riders on the eastern rise, and I have never sanded it out, and I never will. And I have the thing I learned in the dark of that barn, kneeling over a man I had every reason to kill and chose instead to keep. The thing I told you at the very start that you would not believe until your own moment came for you. You do not know what you will do. None of us do. We carry around inside us a person we have never met, a self that only the worst morning of our lives will introduce us to, and when that morning comes it will not ask whether you are ready. It will only ask what you are. I found out what I was in a leaning barn on 40 stubborn acres, with the chickens gone silent and the blood in the dust, and a stranger turning his head away to make it easier for me to be the worst version of myself. I did not take the easy thing he offered. That is the whole of it. That is everything. I am an old woman and my hand is tired and the light is going, and there is one more thing I have always meant to write down at the end of this, the thing he would once said, the thing that